so glad to have you with us tonight. I'm excuse Angie who's not able to be with us tonight. So again, the flower is gone and you'll have to put up with the weed, but I'm excited for this webinar. It's on ivermectin, and of all the things that happened during COVID, this is a great example of the misinformation and heavy-handedness of the efforts that went against allowing therapeutic drugs to be provided for millions and millions of people who suffered because Dr. Fauci and those in Big Pharma wanted to have a vaccine, and they wanted the money that entailed the billions and billions of dollars entailed in bringing a new vaccine to the market and not allowing repurposed drugs that had existed for 50, 60, 70 years to be used to bless people in early treatment. And it was so effective that the vaccines wouldn't have been needed. But none of that has come out sufficiently. And the people who were behind all that have not paid the price. There's been no justice really. But that's despite the efforts of some brave doctors we'll talk about, and the behind the scenes kinds of things that you may not be aware of, but that are written by Dr. Pierre Corey, who took it upon himself to stand up for truth and gave his whole career, sacrificed his career to get this out. And he wrote this book, The War on Ivermectin. And so we're going to take a look at that today. So before we get into ivermectin, though, I want to talk a little bit about hydroxychloroquine, because that was the first drug that came out. There's no book on the war against hydroxychloroquine, but of course there should be. President Trump heard about it from Dr. Vladimir Zelenko in the summer of 2020. So the pandemic had just begun in the United States, and Dr. Zelenko wrote to him saying he was having this great success using hydroxychloroquine. That whole effort was ridiculed because of the left, the liberal left, who hated Trump, and their hatred for Trump, bringing that to the public's attention, resulted in millions and millions of deaths. So I hope at some point in time that people will be held responsible, because it was all politically motivated, but the public were the ones that suffered, and millions of people died. Dr. Simone Gold from America's Frontline Doctors tried to get the word out after Dr. Zelenko, because all of these doctors who were actually treating patients and using hydroxychloroquine were having this great success. So they held a press conference on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court to tell the public about it. But and they had several doctors there testifying of it. But all that information was smeared. There were campaigns against it, and they were just targeted by Big Pharma and by those who did not want that word to get out, especially the Trump haters. And just because they hated Trump so much, academia and Big Pharma attacked and kept this information from getting to the public. And it really is a crime, because hydroxychloroquine, as we've talked about previously, is a zinc ionophore, which means that it is able to embed itself in the glycocalyx of cells and actually get zinc, the mineral zinc, transported across from the bloodstream and the fluid part of the body into the cell, where it can actually stop zinc. That ion will stop the replication of coronaviruses and many, many viruses, not just COVID-19, but many viruses. And that all was smeared, and no early treatment was provided to people. They were just, when they went to the hospital, they were sent back home until they went into respiratory failure and needed to be ventilated. And of course, many of them died as a result of that. So that whole activity is criminal. And I have a hope somewhere in the back of my mind, knowing that it's never going to happen, but a hope that people will be held accountable for those actions, for what they did, in not allowing the real science, the truth, to be told to the public. So there were fraudulent studies that were part of the smear campaign. These were designed and paid for by the NIH, Dr. Fauci, who funds all of the grants that go to drugs and infectious diseases. And so all of it was fraudulent because they wanted to paint the picture that hydroxychloroquine was not effective, so they could continue with their vaccine production, trying to build the vaccine, which they wouldn't even get around to building until the late 2020. And we had something already in the summer of 2020 that would have stopped COVID-19 in its tracks. So all of these studies that they touted, this is how they worked. They would, hydroxychloroquine is an early treatment protocol. So you want to get it at the beginning before the virus replicates too much. So within the first 5 to 7 days of infection, that way you stop the virus from replicating and you have either no infection or very mild infection, and people are saved. Their lives are saved. They never get into serious infection. But what they would do in these studies was they would wait till like 10 or 15 or 20 days, and then they would give hydroxychloroquine. Well, by that time, the virus is already replicated throughout the body, so you're not going to see the benefits to hydroxychloroquine. They also skewed the amount given. Instead of giving the recommended dosage that was being prescribed by these doctors who were in the field, they gave tens of times higher levels and made it toxic, which you can do to any drug. If you exceed the level of the drug, the lethal death, the dosage level, you can make any drug, including Tylenol or aspirin or cold syrup. You can make it where it can hurt you and kill you even. And so this is what they did. They prescribed way too much. And so they came back with these fraudulent studies saying that hydroxychloroquine didn't work. Well, the people who were out there who were actually treating people, unlike Dr. Fauci, who was just in his white coat, academician, just who didn't treat a single soul, but just pontificated in their ivory towers and disregarded the doctors that were in the field actually prescribing and trying to find something that worked. These doctors formed a group, and Dr. Corey was part of this Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, or the FLCCC. And all through the COVID pandemic, I would reference them. So in the last 3 or 4 years, I would reference their protocols. And those of you who wrote to me, any kinds of treatments for COVID-19 would reference these protocols that they developed, these early treatment protocols. So Dr. Pierre Corey and Dr. Paul Merrick were the founding members, and they established a protocol, and it's had different names over the years, but on the slide it says Math Plus, because they were prescribing methylprednisolone for inflammation, ascorbic acid, thiamine, which is just vitamin B1, heparin for anti-clotting, and things like melatonin, zinc, of course, and vitamin D3. And so this protocol that they had and tested out in the field was available, and they would try to get it out to as many people as they can. So these were doctors who were working with real people in real treatment centers. But again, the whole medical paradigm led by Dr. Fauci all worked to keep this information from getting to the public, from being validated or tested. So this protocol eventually resulted in a documentary film being created, and people who watched this formed a medical freedom movement, and those donations came in to help this not-for-profit FLCCC do the work. And they eventually prescribed hydroxychloroquine with ivermectin, and both of those drugs were repurposed and had great benefit. So ivermectin, what is ivermectin? Excuse me. Um, it was discovered by a Japanese microbiologist, Satoshi Amura, who was on a golf course in Honshu, Japan, and unearthed this bacteria, streptomyces. And he was so interested by what he saw with this bacteria that he sent it to William Campbell at Merck Research Laboratory in the United States. And they eventually worked together to get this drug called ivermectin, which is what they found would eliminate, in the beginning, they were focused on eliminating parasites that were found in animals and humans. And it's interesting that this Japanese strain of the bacterium has never been found anywhere else in any part of the world. So the fact that he found this bacteria in Japan, and it doesn't appear to exist anywhere else that we've been able to find, just a miracle. And it's the only source for ivermectin. But ivermectin was not just something that came out for COVID-19. It's been used for decades to treat in Africa these terrible diseases called river blindness and elephantiasis. And these are things that are in the water in Africa, and people, of course, in poverty who don't have access to clean water, they become blind. So they become river blindness is what they call it, as a result of this parasite. And so ivermectin virtually eliminated the parasites responsible for these two horrible diseases. So it rid disfigurement from these diseases. Campbell and Omura won the Nobel Prize in Medicine back in 2015 for their discovery. And this was all connected with these parasites in Africa that were causing thousands of people these diseases and illnesses and blindness. And so it wasn't until later that it was discovered that it was so useful in treating COVID-19, which is a virus. And so it was repurposed, as we find for many of the drugs. And that's where you probably heard of ivermectin. But it had been used for decades to treat those diseases with amazing benefits. So Senator Ron Johnson held a COVID gathering in Congress, and he was concerned about the lack of early treatment for COVID-19. And so he had this hearing in November 2020, and he had Dr. Peter McCullough, who's a great heart cardiologist, heart doctor, who's been on the forefront of fighting this fight for COVID-19 and getting these drugs out to people, developing protocols also. Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. George Fareed, and these people had treated thousands of people for COVID with using hydroxychloroquine and using ivermectin. And so he held this conference, and out of that conference, there was such great response, even though the mainstream media would not cover it, and Big Pharma did everything it could to dismiss it, ignore it. He held another conference in December 2020, and he had Dr. Pierre Corey and Dr. Merrick come. And that's when ivermectin got its very, very big news. And Dr. Corey especially had a very passionate appeal, as only Dr. Corey, if you've ever heard him speak, talking about the benefits of ivermectin and the need for early treatment. And so Fox News during the hearing called him up and said, "We need to interview you." So they did. And his interview went viral, and many, many people saw it, became aware of ivermectin. But because it became viral, the push from the medical establishment, because they started to see their emergency use authorization become in danger. The vaccine was just starting to come out. They didn't want a drug to take away the money represented by the vaccine development. And so the pushback was enormous. as they tried to get this information out. It's incomprehensible, really, when you start to look at how much data is there for ivermectin. Over 95 studies from over 1,000 scientists involving 135,000 patients from 27 different countries. And they all document how effective ivermectin is in early treatment of this disease. And not only just early treatment, but ivermectin turns out to be even effective later on. There were 95 controlled trials, 78 of them published in peer-reviewed medical journals. There's been widespread use of ivermectin in other foreign countries like Argentina and Brazil, Mexico, India. It's one of the most studied and proven therapies in the history of medicine. And so the cost per treatment of this using ivermectin is in the tens of dollars, where, of course, drugs that are approved by the NIH or by the FDA are thousands and thousands of dollars. So those all flow to big pharma, and they couldn't have that. So again, their response was, it's no wonder, but what's incredible is that they could keep all of those studies and smear all of those studies in such a way that the public could not get the truth from it and see what the NIH and the fraudulent doctors of big pharma paid for sponsored doctors were advocating. They couldn't see through the fog. And so, again, millions of people died needlessly. So there should be an uproar against these people who permitted family members of countless families in the United States and Italy and throughout the world to die needlessly, without needing to die. This was no worse than the common flu, a bad case of the flu. And it could have been treated, it could have been handled in a much different way. So again, these, just for example, in the Japanese Journal of Antibiotics in March 2021, there was a meta-analysis of almost 15,000 patients, 42 clinical trials, 21 of them were randomized control trials, which of course, that's what Fauci always touts. You got to have a randomized control trial. So there were plenty of them, almost 3,000 patients. And they showed that early treatment was improvement in these patients 83% of the time. 83%. In late treatments, they had improvement in 51% of the patients. Preventing the disease from onset, meaning from getting the disease, 89% effective. And based on the superior performance of ivermectin, the probability that ivermectin doesn't work is 1 in 4 trillion. So these are very impressive statistics, and you cannot argue with these statistics, but of course, big pharma would try to ignore them and push them away. And that's what the NIH, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, shame on them, and the Centers for Disease Control, all of them touting the same politically correct narrative that only vaccines were acceptable. And so they ignored all this data from on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And mainstream media never held them accountable because, well, mainstream media used to be for the little guy, but they're now funded by the big guy. So big pharma funds mainstream media, so they are no longer holding these regulatory agencies, the political machinery, they're not holding them accountable. They're paid by those same people, so they tout the same politically correct message. So that's why it didn't have a chance. It's amazing that it didn't have a chance because the data is so clear. The science, Dr. Fauci, is not you. It's actually here in these studies, and it is so clear. Shame on you, Dr. Fauci. here is the tactics for COVID disinformation. There are 5 tactics that were perfected during the fake COVID pandemic. They're football plays. You have the fake. So they conduct counterfeit science and they try to pass it off as legitimate. So they sponsor and they pay for these studies to be performed, but they alter, like I said, they increase the toxicity of the amount of drug given. So it shows to be toxic and not the standard dosage. They give a lethal dosage. They do it at the wrong time, not at the beginning of the epidemic. They give it at the end. They plant ghost-written editorials in medical journals that appear that lots of doctors are agreeing to this, but it's all been written by a couple doctors and made to look like it represents a whole class of doctors. So they only selectively publish negative results. They don't mention the positive. So again, this is a fake, and it's a move that they made all through the COVID. Another move is called the Blitz, which is where they harass scientists. So anyone who speaks out for these particular drugs, like ivermectin, are smeared. And so they're attacked by the industry. Instead of having a conversation or having a discussion, you can't have that because the truth would come out. So you can't have a discussion. You just got to smear them and make them, talk over them and make sure they can't share with the public the truth. So that's called the Blitz. You have the diversion, where you get manufacturer and you create uncertainty by paying for these studies that are false, so that you can say, oh, well, it looks like the science is unsettled. It looks like, oh, well, in some cases it works, but in other cases it doesn't work. So don't pay any attention to it. The screen is when you buy credibility from academia. So these are people who get funded by Dr. Fauci. And so they're paid to say what Dr. Fauci once said. Otherwise, you don't get any more grants. So they have this power. If you want any more funding, you better toe the party line. And you don't have to be blatant about it, but you can just make sure that that word is out. And so if you don't toe the party line, you don't get any more funding. So that's called the screen. And then the fix is where you use money and power to manipulate government officials. So they start to influence what's going on. So we're going to see some of that. Big Pharma, again, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Merck, Eli Lilly, GlaxoSmithKline, Moderna. All of these represent the largest lobby group on Capitol Hill. These guys are bigger than the oil and gas industry, 3 times bigger than the next biggest industry of lobbyists. They spend more money than 490 of the top 500 Fortune 500 companies. Amazing. More money than 490 of them? Wow. In 2021, they spent $356 million on Congress to lobby. That means when you have 535 members of Congress, the senators and the House of Representatives, that's $665,000 per member. You don't think these guys have influence in Congress? Oh my gosh. So this is why you don't get only a few, like Senator Rand Paul, Senator Ron Johnson, only a few go against Big Pharma because they're getting a lot of money to tout and toe Big Pharma's line. So, and when they do get caught and they get punished, which they do, their outlook on these fines is that, and they paid $33 billion in fines between 2003 and 2016, 33 billion, they look at it as a marketing expense. So that's how they do it. They don't feel bad about it. They just they got to get the word out. So if they have to pay a fine, that's logged off as marketing expense. You know, that's how you play the game. I want to relay this particular story in the next couple of slides because, again, this gives a very in-depth view of what happened with ivermectin, because ivermectin could have been out to people and blessed so many people. But this is the type of stuff that went on behind the scenes and kept ivermectin from getting out. Andy Hill worked with the World Health Organization. He was a researcher who supported them, and he was compiling the data supporting ivermectin, and he presented those findings several times. But on January 16th, 2021, 10 days before the NIH presentation, where they would hear this presentation on ivermectin, he changed his scientific conclusion. He had been giving this presentation for months, for weeks and months, and he changed it 10 days before this huge presentation. He kept the body of the presentation with the 59 random controlled trials showing that ivermectin reduced inflammation, had all these great biomarkers, cleared COVID virus from people, significantly shortened hospital stays, resulted in an incredible 75% reduction in mortality. That's deaths. 75% reduction in death. What would that have done for families? Despite, and they kept that in the paper, despite having all of that stay in the paper, he changed his conclusion, which is a common thing that people do all the time. They did it with cholesterol. They do it all the time because nobody reads the body of the paper. They only read the conclusion. Doctors do this all the time because they don't have time and they don't have the statistical wherewithal to go read it. But the body shows clearly that ivermectin was this great benefit. But he changes the conclusion, and he says the findings argued against ivermectin. And that was like, what are you doing, Andy Hill? And so Dr. Tess Lawley, who is in United Kingdom, called him and got him on recording saying that he was pressured by the people above him to change the conclusion. And so he did. So this is how the political process works, and the tactics of big pharma. So millions of people lost their lives because he was not faithful to science, and he changed his conclusion. And if anybody reads the paper, you'll see that obviously ivermectin is wonderful, but he changed the conclusion. Now, what's interesting about Andy Hill is that in March of that following year, when he stopped working, he wasn't being paid anymore by those same people. He repented. He published a meta-analysis in July that was astoundingly positive towards ivermectin in his conclusions. But guess what? Mainstream media totally ignored it because he'd already come out before they'd got what they wanted. So they totally ignored July. And 8 days later, on July 14th, one of the largest and most positive trials in Andy's meta-analysis was retracted from the preprint server. It had been up for 8 months, and the journal pulls it because Andy Hill just got out and said it was part of his view supporting ivermectin. That same day, a journalist, a hack, working for something called GRFTR News, was paid to write an article titled, "Why was a major study on ivermectin for COVID-19 just retracted?" And this is in the UK, he paints this picture of this fraudulent study, and it was pulled back because it wasn't true, but it was true. But his smear campaign made all of mainstream media in the United Kingdom. And so they saw, oh, yeah, they retracted it. So Andy Hill must not have a right. We must not believe him. In fact, there have been 6 huge counterfeit trials. And again, this is all part of the fake that we mentioned. This is again how they show, and I've listed them on this slide, but this is how they show, or they try to show, that ivermectin is not useful against COVID. So each one of these, the mainstream media blared out to the public, oh, ivermectin is not good. It's not effective. But every single one of these 6 trials showed ivermectin was superior to the placebo. You know, they arranged these studies so that it wouldn't have statistically significant effect, because they play with the numbers, but it was more effective than a placebo. And all 6 of these studies show that, but the mainstream media comes out and says, oh, ivermectin's not effective. So again, all of this fraudulent effort to get this information out. And what's interesting is most of these studies were conducted in South America, where ivermectin was already popular, being used. So when they had their placebo group and their ivermectin group, it turns out that the placebo group is already on ivermectin. So you're comparing placebo ivermectin people with ivermectin people, and you're trying to see, is there a benefit? Is there a change? Well, there's no change. They're both on ivermectin. So this is the game they play to keep the study from being statistically significant. So this is just so fraudulent. This is so fake, so false science. And the journals are the worst. The New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the Lancet, the Annals of Internal Medicine. I've used all of these journals in the past because these are the gold standard for peer-reviewed published studies, but they showed their true colors during the pandemic. They all are funded by Big Pharma. So anything that goes against Big Pharma, they squelch. So that's why when you look at those studies, they retract studies that happen to get published. They pull them. The studies that are peer review used to be a check and balance, but now it's not. It's just, is it politically correct or not? So when the first of the big 6 trials came out, those fake trials, 100 scientists wrote an open letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association calling for its retraction, because they said, this is why this study is wrong. This is fake, fraudulent study. But JAMA still published it as a peer-reviewed study, and they ignored these scientists. So this is the game. This is what you're up against. The Goliath that you're trying to fight. If you're one of these doctors who is out in the world trying to treat patients, and you go up against the system, of all systems that have systemic problems, the American Medical Association is the worst. So they are so fraudulently anti-science. They are politically bought. And so they are just buffoons for Big Pharma. It's so sad. And it's not me just saying it. This is Dr. Marcia Angel, who was editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association. She resigned 20 years ago in June of 2000 and wrote a book called The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It. And this is what she said. Now, this is the editor-in-chief, and this was her experience as head editor of JAMA. She says, now primarily a marketing machine to sell drugs of dubious benefit, Big Pharma uses its wealth and power to co-opt every institution that might stand in its way, including the US Congress, the Food and Drug Administration, academic medical centers, and the medical profession itself. It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I have reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor for the New England Journal of Medicine. That's pretty powerful coming from the head of the chief editor of that, what used to be prestigious journal, but which is now just a front for Big Pharma. So this is where it's coming. So you get these journal retractions and rejections because they are not going to print things that are favorable or go against what Big Pharma wants. So major retractions that had positive ivermectin studies. Dr. Corey details this in his book. I've just listed these 3 there on the slide. These were all retracted because they show positive benefit for ivermectin. And the journal rejected, didn't even publish these studies down at the bottom from doctors that were amazing doctors. And you can see them listed right there. They rejected them, no reason given, except that they were positive for ivermectin, but they weren't going to say that in writing. So you can't get the good stuff published, and the good stuff that happens to get published gets pulled. So it was censored by big tech, of course, social media. There was a war on COVID that we saw during COVID. There was a mega monopoly called the Trusted News Initiative, TNI. So these big mainstream media people, the BBC, social media like Facebook and Google, Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Microsoft, European Broadcasting Union, they all got together and formed this Trusted News Initiative. And they worked to discredit, to brand, to censor. YouTube, one of the worst, censoring anything that had to do with ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. And they're still the same, even today. So you may have heard of the Twitter files. And when Elon Musk bought the company, he gave Matt Taibbi access to all of the files that showed that Twitter was in cahoots with the White House, with the FBI, with all these government agencies, the FDA, the CDC, the NIH. Whatever they said, they censored. And they came up, of course, with 12 major disinformation people, and they censored those people. They went against these people, and they just were in cahoots. So all of this discussion was totally censored. And the last campaign I want to share with you was, I think you'll remember, the horse dewormer campaign. In August 2021, ivermectin use was still growing exponentially. People were seeing, and we had now other social media avenues to get the word out. And people were fed up with Fauci and with the mainstream medical system. And they were seeing through that the truth wasn't there and it was over here. And we were starting to get the word out and the public was responding. And so the FDA came out with a campaign on August 21st that said, "You're not a horse, you're not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it." And on TV, all the late show comedians came out talking about people who were taking horse dewormer. And they made this big deal about how ivermectin was used against parasites. It can't possibly have any benefit for COVID-19 virus. And so they were constantly playing this over and over, trying to get the public to stop. And they pressured governments. So state governments, pharmaceuticals were ordered to stop supplying or complying with doctors' prescriptions for ivermectin. I don't know if you remember that. you could not get ivermectin because doctors were not, their prescription was no longer valid. Pharmaceutical companies were ordered by state governments not to fill them. So all of this fraudulent, there was activity down in Texas, some fake report that said, oh, emergency centers in hospitals are being overrun by ivermectin overdose cases of this horse dewormer. And they weren't being overrun. It was completely fake. There was no such thing. They went to the hospital and reported that, no, there's no problem here. It's fake news. When you see it that fake, it's just unbelievable that in this country, the mainstream media will not hold accountable these lies, this deception. They talk about misinformation and disinformation, and they're the biggest purveyors of it. But no one will call them because they're our journalists. They're the ones who are supposed to protect the public from these big, powerful entities, but they are now bought. So there's no one protecting the public. So that horse dewormer campaign got a lot of traction. You may remember Joe Rogan got COVID, and CNN published doctored pictures of him looking deathly ill, colored with yellow, kind of a yellow smear on his picture to make him look deathly sick. And he called him on it. Rolling Stones published fabricated articles. But Joe Rogan was key to getting the truth out to his 16 million viewers that said, hey, you people are lying. Ivermectin works. And by the way, that's not my picture. You've altered it. You're playing games. You're lying to the public. So he called CNN, and CNN has lost viewership since then. They continue to lose viewership because only the people who love to bash Trump and who are hard left leaning watch CNN anymore because it works for them, but there's no truth there. Now, I want to pay tribute to these people whose career was killed and who fight the fight anyway because they are in it for the truth to get out. They're not making any money. They're constantly harassed. They're constantly smeared. The financial organizations pull funding. Banks like Visa pull their accounts, like Dr. Joseph Mercola, Citibank pulled all of their funding for his entire organization and all the people who worked for him. They just pulled and shut their bank accounts. If that doesn't sound like Justin Trudeau in Canada, what he did against the truckers who are fighting against mandatory vaccinations, I don't know what is. We have the same type of problem in the United States of America. So, and President Biden is still doing the same kinds of things, fighting against people who are trying to get the word out. So these are some of the folks who've paid the ultimate price, whose careers have been destroyed, but who are still fighting. And of course, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy, probably the only one who would actually clean house in the medical side of things. The Centers for Disease Control, the NIH, the FDA, he'll do it. If he gets elected, he will clean out the swamp. It's the medical swamp because it's pretty bad. So this book written by Dr. Corey, wonderful book. If you want the details, it's not hard to read. He's passionate and he's just a great individual. I've heard him speak several times, and a wonderful fight. And these are the people that you can look up to and admire for giving everything to the truth and not kowtowing to the pressures that come from high up, even from the White House. So anyway, that concludes this presentation. Of course, we will take a few minutes to go. If you go over to the chat area, you can click on, and go to where we have our Q&A session. You'll see it up here on the right. We'll have Q&A with you and look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.